Okay, so the immune system relates to cell communication. We're going to talk about how these cells communicate with one another to protect us. So a brief overview of the whole chapter. And the animal must defend itself from the many dangerous pathogens. Pathogens are anything that is disease-causing that can make an organism sick. So that's what a pathogen is. So that can be bacteria, it can be viruses, and so on. So two major kinds of defense have evolved. We have innate and acquired immunity. So that's what the first part we're going to talk about here. So innate immunity is present before any exposure to pathogens and is effective from the time of birth. So this is not something that is quote unquote learned by being exposed to harmful things. This is something that is in us to protect us, and it's very non-specific. So it involves non-specific responses. So it's the same response to a bacteria as to a virus and so on, so it's just a generic. Innate immunity consists of external barriers, so external barriers on the outside of the organism, plus internal cellular and chemical defenses. They have external and internal things. Key internal defenses are macrophages, and other phagocytic cells. Phagocytic sounds a lot like the word phagocytosis, which is a type of endocytosis. And so remember when the membrane is dense, and we talked about this with like unicellular organisms bringing in food that are too big to get through the membrane. So you have these macrophages that actually digest and take in foreign particles, and we get rid of them that way. So those are very non-specific. And then we have more specific, which is called acquired. This is immunity that you acquire or you get within your lifetime. Or sometimes it's called adaptive immunity because we adapt and our immune system kind of changes as we're exposed to new pathogens. And it develops after exposure to agents such as microbes. Microbes are bacteria, can be toxins, or other foreign substances. So sometimes it can even be like pollen, and we'll talk about allergies later. It involves a very specific response to pathogens. So it's a one-on-one attack with a very specific pathogen. So what works for one will not work for another type of pathogen. So recognition is by white blood cells called lymphocytes. You may have heard about B and T cells of your immune system. Those are examples of lymphocytes. Some lymphocytes produce antibodies. I'm sure you've heard of those. And others, their job, instead of producing antibodies, is to destroy infected cells. Sometimes they can also destroy cancer cells and any foreign tissue that is put in your body. So we'll talk about like tissue rejection and getting transplants and things like that. So if we look at this chart here, we have innate immunity right here, and so it has external and internal defenses. So here's your invading microbes. So our external defenses, our first line of defense would be our skin. Our skin is a barrier between the outside environment and the inside of our body. So our skin definitely helps to keep things out. Mucous membranes, we have mucus lining our nasal passages and things like that. So anything that we may breathe in or take in, the idea is it gets stuck to the mucus and the mucous membrane, and so therefore doesn't make it inside of our body, and then we get rid of that mucus. I think I've talked a little bit about the trachea, the windpipe that goes down. Like if this is your mouth, remember the trachea goes down into your lungs. Eventually it breaks off and goes to both lungs, and so on and so forth. So it goes down to your lungs. But remember I talked about the cells lining the trachea. These cells here have cilia. So I'm not going to draw all of it. Cilia. And on top of that cilia, the little hair-like structures, you have a layer of mucus. And so what happens is, as you breathe in through your mouth, and that some of that bacteria and things like that get stuck in the mucus in your nose, or breathe in through your nose, I should say. And the bacteria also then, as it goes down your trachea, can get stuck. And this doesn't have to be bacteria. It can be viruses. It can be skin cells from people floating around in the air. It can be dust. All of that gets stuck here. And then remember that the cilia sweeps and goes up and sweeps all that mucus to the back of your throat, which then you have a passageway to another tube, not the trachea. Let's label that actually. Not the trachea, but the esophagus, that then will take it down and you digest it in your digestive system. So that's an example of mucous membranes, and get one of our first external lines of defenses. And then secretions can also trap, so that kind of goes with that. So traps things in there. So you have secretions, you have your eye, and it'll bring the liquid, will bring it, any foreign particles, to the corner of your eye, and so on. So anyway, the internal defenses, let's go through some of the examples of this. Remember, these are very non-specific, so these guys are acting the same way no matter what the pathogen is. So you have phagocytic cells. These are cells that go through phagocytosis. They engulf the foreign particles and destroy them. There are antimicrobial proteins. We'll talk about those. Antimicrobial. Microbial means bacterial, so they're antibacterial, so they're going to help to destroy that. We'll talk about the inflammatory response. That is when we first maybe have a cut or something like that. And then you have these guys called natural killer cells that will also work non-specifically. And so this is the first part that we're going to talk about. And then we'll get into acquired immunity, where we'll talk about the role of B and T cells and so on. So these are more, as it says here, rapid. This is more of a slower response. And so you have to build up some immunity or acquire it. So let's look at this first part here today. First, the innate human immunity. A pathogen that breaks through external defenses encounters innate cellular and chemical mechanisms that impede its attack. And so the external defenses, this is blank, and mucous membranes are physical barriers. What would we put in there? Skin. Skin is one of our first line of defenses. It helps us to keep out microorganisms, bacteria, and viruses. Mucous membranes produce, what do they produce? Why are they called mucous membranes? Because they produce mucus. A viscous fluid that traps microbes and other particles. So it's kind of thick, and it traps it much in the same way that I just drew. So in the trachea, ciliated epithelial cells sweep mucus and any entrapped microbes upward, preventing microbes from entering the, where do we want them to stop from entering the, let's go back over here, the lungs. We don't want to get all that in the lungs, so therefore it's keeping and protecting our internal environment, in this case the lungs. Secretions of the skin and mucous membranes provide a hostile environment to microbes. And so what does that mean? Like, it could change the pH, and so make it so that microbes, it's not ideal for them to divide and live on that in that area. So secretions give the skin a pH between 3 and 5 that's acidic enough to prevent colonization of many microbes. So we don't have them taking root and growing on us. Skin secretions include proteins such as lysozymes. These are enzymes. Notice it doesn't end in ACE, but these are a class of enzymes which digest bacterial cell walls, and so therefore help to defend us. And so those bacteria on the skin never make it even inside of our body, because they are killed before they're able to do that. So those are the physical things. For nonspecific internal things, we have cellular and chemical defenses. Internal cellular defenses depend mainly on what are called phagocytes. These guys do phagocytosis. They ingest. So white blood cells, called phagocytes, ingest microorganisms and initiate inflammation. So we're going to talk in just a second about inflammation. Okay, so phagocytes are a type of white blood cell. So let's look at these phagocytic cells. The phagocytes attach to prey. In this case, the prey is like a bacteria via surface receptors. So the receptors, the phagocyte receptors, bind to the receptors on the surface of the quote-unquote prey of the bacteria and engulf them, forming a vacuole that fuses with what's the organelle that has digestive enzymes that it might fuse with? If you said lysosome, you would be correct. So it fuses with the lysosome. So that's what we're seeing here. So this is the macrophage. This is the phagocyte. So I use the word phagocyte. A macrophage is the type of phagocyte. It does phagocytosis. And so notice here are the microbes. It forms these, it says the pseudopod is the kind of the protrusion coming off of here, which going to form a little vacuole that's eventually going to pinch off. So we see here pinching off, and now we have a vacuole with the microbes inside of it. Here's your lysosome. These guys right here fuse. So you get the enzymes mixing with the microbes, so you get them all digested in this vacuole. So this digests the lysosome containing enzymes. When it fuses, digests the microbes. And then the vacuole fuses with the membrane again and expels the digested contents of the microbes, and this is exocytosis. So it's leaving via exocytosis. So that's kind of why this is called a phagocytic cell, because it goes around and engulfs foreign particles and digests them and basically destroys them, hopefully before those microbes can get into and infect a cell of your body, and so before you get sick. Macrophages, a type of phagocyte, migrate through the body and are found in organs of the lymphatic system. So these guys aren't stationary. They're found all over the place, and they take in foreign particles. And they also are found in this lymphatic system. I'm sure you've heard of lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are a big part of this lymphatic system, which we're going to briefly talk about here. The lymphatic system defends against pathogens. And so this also helps, in addition to the immune system, to fight off foreign particles so that we don't get sick. So here we have the lymphatic system, and it's kind of small here. The lymphatic system, I'm going to take a pink color here, and I'm just going to box in the parts of the lymphatic system: adenoids, tonsils, lymph nodes, your spleen, are main parts of your lymphatic system. And so your appendix and lymphatic vessels. All right, so what I need you to know about is we're going to talk about the lymph nodes and the spleen. Some of what we talk about with the lymph nodes are the same as what goes on in the tonsils and in the adenoids. So if we look over here, let's do the lymph nodes, and let's write down what happens to them. Lymph nodes, it's hard to see. I'm going to show you a bigger picture just so that you can see, and it's in your textbook as well. But if you look here, your lymph nodes are all these little dots here. And you have these lymphatic vessels. They're kind of like, your blood vessels, except the lymphatic vessels carry lymph, which is a fluid. So you have another fluid moving all throughout your body in separate vessels called the lymphatic vessels, and they flow through these lymph nodes. There are some in your neck and so on and so forth. So their lymph nodes are all over, you can see, of your body. And this fluid, how this helps with the immunity is this fluid, if we look at this picture over here, let me move it over here so there's not a glare. If we look at this picture here, here's a lymphatic vessel, and here's your blood vessels. Capillaries are the smallest. It says blood capillary. These are your smallest blood vessels. So this picture is this picture over here in your notes. But I want you to see that the blood and the lymph are separate. So what happens is here are your cells of your tissues in your body. So it's kind of hard to see those over here in this picture here. So you can, in between there, put some cells in there. So you have some cells like that. That's what this picture here is showing you. And this is figure 24.3 in your book as well. And these cells are bathed in fluid called the interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid, this is that's right here. Well, I won't do it in pink here. Interstitial fluid is like the extracellular fluid that bathes cells. If you notice here, there's these arrows here. So what this is trying to show you is that this interstitial fluid enters in the lymphatic vessel. And so it enters in there and flows throughout your body. And when it gets to a lymph node, what the lymph node does, let's write here. Let's go back to where I was going to write right here. If there's any microbes, so if there are any foreign particles, they enter into the lymphatic system, the lymph, that fluid, and flow through the body and eventually hit a lymph node. So when it hits that lymph node, the microbes in the interstitial fluid, that's the fluid, remember, surrounding the cells, flow into the lymph and get trapped in lymph nodes. That's what happens. And this happens also in the spleen. It can get trapped in the spleen. Microbes in the blood get trapped in kind of like a net-like structure in your spleen. Does the same thing with your tonsils and so on. So while I put an arrow here for the lymph nodes, all of these kind of work in that manner. And so why is it important when they get trapped, the microbes? Because once it gets trapped in the lymph nodes, what happens is what is in the lymph nodes are those macrophages that migrate in our phagocytic cells. So the macrophages engulf them, just like we just talked about here. So the macrophages take them, engulf them, and get rid of them. And so let's think about when you guys get sick and you go to the doctor, oftentimes they feel up in your neck and they'll say, oh, your lymph nodes are swollen. Your swollen lymph nodes are a sign of infection. Why? Because, well, they feel them near the neck because they're close to the surface and you can actually feel them pretty well, but there are lots of other ones. These are just ones that you can get at easily to be able to tell. But what's happening is if you do have an infection, those microbes get into that lymph and get into those lymph nodes, and then your macrophages are working overtime, engulfing them, and they actually swell up as the nodes swell up as these macrophages are, eating them up, I guess you could say, engulfing them. And so swollen lymph nodes are a sign of infection. And so we can see here that this picture, which is this picture down here, shows you, here are the lymphatic vessels, and that lymph flows in. There's these valves. Notice there are these valves right here. They're like swinging doors. So when pressure gets put on the swinging doors, they only swing in one direction, and that's this direction. That's why they won't go back out of the lymph nodes there. And so it flows in this direction, and the macrophages, and there's also cells called lymphocytes, they will digest and try and get rid of those microbes, and so then the lymph continues to flow through these one-way doors, and that's what happens with your lymph nodes when you're ill. And that's why the doctor feels them. Okay, so that is one line of defense in the internal cellular and chemical defenses is the phagocytic cells. And so then there's also antimicrobial proteins. And so these proteins function in innate defense by attacking microbes. Hence the name antimicrobial, directly or impeding their reproduction. So they either kill them or stop them from reproducing. About 30 proteins make up what's called the complement system, which causes lysis of the invading cells and helps trigger inflammation. Lysis means that remember we talked about lysis with diffusion osmosis, kind of if you puncture holes in the membrane and the cell splits and all the parts go out and so on. And so lysis would be when a red blood cell gets put in a hypertonic solution and it actually ends up exploding. So we have this complement system that can cause this to happen, and kill the invading cells. So then, if they kill them, then they will not invade our cells. And then lastly, here, interferons provide innate defense against viruses and activate macrophages. So I want to draw here about how they play a role in attacking viruses. I kept my pink pen here. I'm going to switch back to blue. So let's say right here, let's say that you have a virus-infected cell. And what viruses do is they turn the cell into a virus-producing factory. So let's say this is a new virus. So it's causing the cell to make new viruses. And what new viruses then will do is leave and go and try and infect another cell. And so, but what this virus-infected cell does is the virus-infected cell makes a molecule called interferon. And so what it does is releases this interferon. So the cell releases this chemical, hence here's some cell communication. Interferon then goes to another cell of the body, so here's another cell, where the interferon, if there's a receptor here, can bind here, trigger, that's the reception, trigger the signal transduction pathway, and this other cell can produce viral, viral, proteins. So they produce antiviral proteins. And so when that happens, then the new virus that just came out of this one here, this new virus can't infect this cell here. because of its antiviral proteins that it's making. So it will destroy the virus before it actually has a ability to do anything to that. So that's interferon. Okay, and this is innate, so this is generic for any virus. So, and then this interferon also activates macrophages and gets them to come to the area where it'll engulf the viruses and so on. So therefore, this is another type of protein that helps in our protection. So I used the word inflammation earlier. Another kind of generic response is called the inflammatory response. And local inflammation, it says blank, it's histamine. And other chemicals released from injured cells promote changes in blood vessels. These changes allow more fluid and phagocytes and antimicrobial proteins to enter into the infected tissue. So notice here's the inflammatory response is right here. So all these pictures are the inflammatory response. And so what we're going to do is, notice here it says step 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to write down over here what happens in those steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. So step 1 here, you get a pinprick. So you have an injury. So this is where the injury occurs. So what happens is, if you notice here, there are macrophages, and these guys right here are the bacteria. So these guys are the microbes. So it was not a clean pin there. And so we have then chemical signals being released. That's in the little dots here. So the chemical signals are here, and the pathogens in orange there, the pathogens are pink. And so notice here you have your blood vessels. And look at here, so this is the capillary, your smallest blood vessels. Capillaries are the only blood vessels in which things can diffuse into and out of it. So you have your red blood cells, but you also have phagocytic cells. You have white blood cells within your blood as well. So you have red blood cells and white blood cells. You also have these things called platelets and things like that. So that's what we're seeing here. So you get the pinprick, you see the macrophage. So when we were writing here about the injury, that chemical signal that I just put in orange is the release of histamine. We can write by the macrophages and other cells that aren't depicted in here called mast cells. And so they release this chemical signal. Now, what that chemical signal does is trigger some things to happen at the capillaries nearby. So if you look from picture 1 to picture 2, what has happened to the capillary? Look at the diameter. What has happened to it? So we have the capillaries dilate. Another way to say that is widen. And there's no I forgot. And dilate. Just realized I wrote A for N accidentally. So the capillaries widen. And look at here, we have arrows of things coming out here. So the capillaries become more permeable. Sometimes they call it leaky. So what happens is fluid antimicrobial proteins, and clotting elements leak out. And then we also have increased blood flow. I'll just put to the area because of the dilation. So, increased blood flow, this is what causes, think about what happens when, if you got really picked by a pin, is you often at the site of the injury, you get redness. It can feel warmer, you get some heat. You also get some swelling, and so this is because of that leakiness of your capillaries. And so if we look here to number 3, so here's 1 and 2, I'm going to put 3 over here. What's going on in 3? You get more macrophages migrating to the area. So the macrophages, so they're coming out of the blood cell, or blood vessels. All right, and so that's what we see here. So more macrophages migrate to the area, and what are they going to do? Remember, they engulf the particles. Do want to point out the blood clotting elements here. So if we see here over here, the blood clotting elements started to, that's these guys here, come to the area. If we look from this picture to this picture, we can write for step 3 also is that you get your blood clot happening, and so therefore it's going to help to stop those blood clotting elements are going to help to stop and clot that blood, so that bleeding will cease to occur. And so these macrophages will start to engulf, and that's what we see here. They're engulfing all the bacteria. Why these macrophages move is there are other chemicals called chemokines that also, so these guys are attracted to the area based upon the chemicals that are released, kind of like here, the original chemical histamine. The chemokines also attract more of these macrophages to the area. So I'll put attracted by chemicals called chemokines. And then lastly, step 4, we have the phagocytes consuming the bacteria. Remember, macrophages are examples of that. They consume the bacteria and prevent infection. And so this is the inflammatory response. All right, so let's look at natural killer cells. Next, that's the inflammatory response. Natural killer cells attack virus-infected body cells and cancer cells, and they trigger apoptosis, the suicide in the cells that they attack. So these guys, what these guys do, this is a different type of attack. So this, instead of, these guys all work on killing the invading particle like the bacteria or the virus and getting rid of that. Natural killer cells take a different tactic. They look for body cells that have been already attacked, and so they're already infected. And so what they try to do is kill those body cells before they can spread more. And so therefore they're killing, we don't want to keep around cells that something's wrong with it, cells that have been infected with a virus, that now it's going to make new viruses and go infect additional body cells and so on. So these natural killer cells infect these body cells, and how they get it to die is they trigger apoptosis, and the cell actually kills itself. And so natural killer cells are an important line of defense that works a little bit different than the other ones. So when we look at different types of organisms, invertebrates versus us, which we are vertebrates, have a backbone. Many invertebrates defend against infection by many of the same mechanisms in vertebrate innate response. And so invertebrates, that's pretty much all they have. So let's go back and look at this picture here. So innate immunity, when we look at this here, let me give you an example of innate immunity. So invertebrates have innate immunity only. And so when we look at the example, insects is in the invertebrate category. So let's just look at some of the examples. So they have an external defense. They have an exoskeleton. They have a dry, tough barrier. Their exoskeleton. Internal defenses, they have some things. So like us, some different defenses. They have a low pH, so it makes it inhospitable for bacteria to grow on it. They have lysozymes. So those are enzymes that digest and break down the cell wall. They have phagocytes. So they have cells capable of doing phagocytosis as well. So they have some internal defenses as well. So innate immunity is found, remember this is nonspecific, and so this is found in invertebrates and vertebrates. We have this as well. Acquired immunity, we're going to get to in the next video, is specific, and this is in vertebrates only. And so that's a big difference in looking at the types of organisms. So we just looked at innate immunity in the insects here. When we look at, let's just here, we've already talked about these. Let's talk about these with humans. So phagocytic cells, that's like the macrophages. But let's write here the antimicrobial proteins. So the examples we just went through in our notes. So that was the interferon that is released by a virus-infected cell that prevents other cells from being infected, and that complement system that causes a cell to lyse. And we talked about the inflammatory response with histamine and so on, and the natural killer cells, remember, these guys here attack, the natural killer cells attack infected cells. Infected cells by releasing chemicals that lead to apoptosis. Okay, so that kind of pulls it all together here, and that is our innate immunity. So we are now at 43.2, where we're going to start talking about acquired immunity, but I'm going to save this for part 2.